Well, welcome to the second session in our Exposit series in Luke's Gospel. And in this session, we are focusing on just the first 4 verses in chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. In our previous session, in the first one, we saw how Luke has written his account of Jesus' life based on the travels of Jesus, first around Galilee, and then on Jesus' final trip to Jerusalem. And right at the start of his Gospel, Luke explains why he has done this, why he's written about Jesus. And so the passage we are looking at in this session is the first major part in Luke's Gospel. Remember, we saw the structure in our previous session. So this is the first of the 5 major sections in Luke's Gospel, where he explains why he wrote his Gospel and how he went about it. Now please would you just take a moment to pause the video and to read chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Now let's have a look at how Luke has structured this short passage. He's introducing Theophilus, and of course I assume that Luke knew that others would be reading this, and so he's introducing his reader to the story that he's about to start telling. And Luke makes 2 main statements in these verses, and they come out in verse 3. 2 main statements. This is what he's saying. He's saying, firstly, that he has carefully investigated everything, and then he says, and I then decided to write an orderly account. He now goes on to say 3 things about these 2 main statements in the other verses. And so firstly, in verse 1, Luke says that he's written his account, but he knows that many others have undertaken to draw up an account of these things as well, things that have been fulfilled among us. So others have done this before Luke, says Luke. Secondly, in verse 2, he says that these other accounts have been handed down to us by eyewitnesses, and they were servants of the word. And then thirdly, in verse 4, Luke says the reason he has done this is because he wants his reader to know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So in verses 1 and 2, Luke immediately links his gospel that he's about to write with what has already been said about Jesus. He's making it very clear, isn't he, that his gospel is not some new story. This is not a different story, but this is in line with what others have said about Jesus. And these other accounts that have come before Luke's have become from reliable people. These are eyewitnesses. These are people who were there. And they made it their work, their life's work, to be servants of the word. In other words, they went out and told people what they had seen and what they had heard. In other words, Luke is making the point right at the beginning that he's not writing a gospel that is different to the story of Jesus, that has already been told by those who were there when it all happened. He says also that what he's going to be writing about are things that have been fulfilled. So there are things that have been fulfilled amongst us. Now, what are these things? Well, it seems as if whatever they are, they're known to Theophilus and anyone who might have read this Luke's Gospel at that time. And he must surely be referring to the events of Jesus' life as told by these eyewitnesses. And so these are well-known things. And of course, the word fulfilled is also very important. Because what we will see is that Luke is very concerned to show his reader that everything that Jesus has come to do is a fulfillment of God's promises in the Old Testament. So the story of Jesus that Luke is going to tell us reaches all the way back to the Old Testament. In fact, we're going to see how Luke takes us all the way back to creation. He understands that the life of Jesus is actually the story of God that begins all the way back in the Old Testament. Now in chapter 3, Luke says that he has very carefully investigated everything. He has been very, very careful about making sure that what he writes is both accurate and true. He has spoken to these eyewitnesses, to those who were there. And Luke says he has also written his gospel in an orderly manner. He's written an orderly account. Now, what does that word orderly mean? Well, it probably means that he has carefully written his gospel in a way so that not just the events are clear to the reader, but also the meaning of the events. In other words, there's not just order to the events, but there is a theological order to what Luke is writing. There's a theological truth. There are truths about God and God's world that shapes the story that he's telling about Jesus. And then in verse 4, Luke gives the reason that he's writing his gospel. He says, I'm writing so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. He wants Theophilus, he wants his readers to be absolutely certain of everything they've heard about Jesus. To be certain about something means that you are confident that it is reliable, that it's trustworthy, and that it also means what you think it means. And so Luke is writing so that his readers will have confidence in the truthfulness, the reliability of the story about Jesus, but not just in the events, but also what the events mean. And in particular, he wants them to be certain that Jesus is indeed the true and real fulfillment of God's Old Testament promises. Luke wants his readers to be totally certain about Jesus, to have full confidence in Jesus. So what is the purpose of this passage? In fact, it's the purpose of the whole book. Luke's purpose is that whoever reads this will come away knowing for certain that the story of Jesus Christ, as Luke tells it here and as others have told it, fulfills everything that God has promised in the Old Testament. He wants people to have full confidence in Jesus. Now, what might that mean for us today? Well, here are some questions to think about. I wonder, how well do you think you know the true story about Jesus? And do you understand what it might mean for your life? How well do you know the gospel? And if you are a Christian, do you ever think of your faith as a step out of uncertainty and into certainty, and not the other way around? Christian faith is a step out of the darkness into the light. That's what Luke is saying. He's saying step out of uncertainty and step into certainty about Jesus. And then lastly, is your faith, is it based on certainty in Jesus as the one who keeps all of God's promises? Is that who you understand Jesus to be? Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope that you are excited and ready to start reading Luke's orderly account in the next session.